On the morning of May 8, 2008, 18-year-old Joshua Maddux informed his family that he was going for a walk. It was a chilly but overall nice day. For Josh, a morning walk or hike was not at all unusual. Josh would soon set off into the wilderness. As the day wore on and the sun began to set, Joshua never returned home. His family was somewhat concerned, but they tried not to worry. Joshua was an adult at this point, and his father had allowed him to come and go freely. But as the sun rose and subsequently set the next day, Joshua's father became far more concerned. Joshua's father, Mike, was quoted as saying, "I went to work one day and came home and he wasn't there. The next day he still didn't come home. I called all his friends. Nobody's seen him. Nobody knows where he is. I didn't know what to do, so I called the police." With the police finally called, the search for Joshua Maddux was now underway. The family had no idea at the time that they wouldn't receive answers for 7 years, and those answers that finally came would only lead to far more horrifying questions. This is the baffling story of Joshua Maddux. Welcome to The Cellar. Joshua Maddux grew up in Woodland Park, Colorado, a neighborhood outside of Colorado Springs. Woodland Park is a home rule municipality in Cellar County, Colorado. Many residents within the community commute to Colorado Springs, which is a roughly 20-mile, half-an-hour drive southeast of Woodland. Woodland Park is surrounded by the 1-million-acre Pike National Forest, with Pikes Peak being one of the area's most famous mountains. Pikes Peak is the highest summit of the southern Front Range of the Rocky Mountains in North America. It is one of many mountains in Colorado that sits at over 14,000 feet in elevation. It is also considered one of the tougher mountain ranges to climb. Woodland Park has a population of around 7,900 residents in total. Joshua grew up in a home that was just a short walk away from both the wilderness and town. There were numerous hiking trails within the area that Joshua enjoyed spending his days traveling. Joshua's sister Ruth was quoted as saying, he loved animals and the outdoors, hiking, fishing, and camping with his friends. Joshua's other sister Kate spoke with media about Joshua's teenage years. She said, his IQ was off the charts. He spent most of his time writing fictional stories and playing music. He had an interesting and unique sense of style. People in his high school class knew him for being that awesome kid who wore a top hat and brought a briefcase to school instead of a backpack. There was this subtle sophistication about him that made him interesting and a standout. From all reports, Joshua was intelligent and very creative. He loved music and would take the time to teach himself how to play numerous instruments, writing songs with friends along the way. Joshua seemed to have a bright and vibrant future ahead of him. Joshua grew up with 2 sisters and a brother. He had a large, loving family, but when Joshua was only 16 years old, tragedy would strike. Joshua's older brother, Zachary, would take his own life just a week prior to graduating high school. Josh had always looked up to his older brother, and losing him at such a young age and in such a devastating manner was extremely hard on the entire family. Joshua's family would come together following the loss, and over the next 2 years they mourned together while trying to figure out how to go on with their lives. Joshua was still described as being friendly and outgoing, like he had always been, but he was clearly trying to make sense of the tragic loss of someone whom he had looked up to so much. Which now brings us to the morning of May 8, 2008. Josh told his family he was going for a walk, but he never returned. Joshua's father, Mike, would spend the next few days contacting all of his friends. After a handful of days had passed, Mike knew he had given his son more than enough time to return on his own. His concern for his son was now at an all-time high, and on May 13th, he called the police department. When he spoke with the police, they were quick to toss around the idea that Josh may have just run away. Being that he was an adult now, and there were no obvious signs of foul play, the police would end up posting missing persons notices, with some searches taking place for Josh within the area, yielding nothing in the end. Soon days would turn to weeks, and weeks would turn to months. Months would become years, and every day Joshua's family hoped and prayed that he would show up at their doorstep, maybe returning with a wife and family in tow. Joshua's sister Kate remained hopeful during those many years. She would later write in the Woodland Park News the following: "Since Josh was 18, it has been reasonable to assume he may have decided to leave town to start a new life. As one of his two older sisters, I have always chosen to believe that this was the case. I've expected Josh to return home to my father's house at any time with a wife and small children so that they can meet their grandparents and two aunts. Josh has always been known for his musical and literary talent, so maybe we would find him playing music with a band on tour, or catch him writing successful novels under a pen name so that he could keep his preferred lifestyle of solitude in the woods." Joshua's father Mike also remained hopeful that his son was out there living his life somewhere, but he was also very practical, worrying considerably that his second son may have followed in the same footsteps of his oldest brother. Perhaps he wandered into the wilderness and decided he no longer wanted to live. As every year passed for the family, they kept on hoping, but whenever a body would be located within the area, they would prepare themselves for the worst, expecting police to come knocking at their door, bearing the bad news that Joshua had been found. But each time a body was found, it ended up not being Josh. That was until 7 years later, in the summer of 2015. Joshua would finally be located, but the discovery would only create far more questions that still, to this very day, have no clear-cut answers. In 2015, a builder from nearby Colorado Springs named Chuck Murphy was in the process of demolishing his old wooden cabin. The cabin sat on a large plot of land that was within a mile of where Joshua Maddux and his family had lived. Chuck Murphy had originally purchased this cabin back in the 1950s. It had formerly been the homestead of Thunderhead Ranch, a locally infamous drinking and gambling complex within town. A man named Big Bert Bergstrom had traveled to America back in 1912. He would end up running the Thunderhead Inn as a dining and drinking establishment, while he used the ranch as an illegal gambling den. Big Bert was eventually arrested by the FBI, but was subsequently found not guilty. Chuck Murphy would then purchase the property in the 1950s, with his brother living in the cabin up until around 2005. When Chuck's brother moved out around 2005, the cabin would end up becoming more of a storage facility, rarely being used or visited, with animals finding their way into the residence. The cabin would soon fall into disrepair, as a foul stench filled the former home. In 2015, Chuck made the decision to tear the cabin down in order to make way for a property development. As August rolled around, the construction crew would get to work. On August 7th, the crew brought in an earth mover to get the more serious aspects of demolition completed. As they reached the fireplace of the cabin, they located and subsequently moved a large breakfast bar table that was blocking off the fireplace. As they moved the breakfast bar and looked within the chimney, a shocking discovery was made. A body was found, upside down and in the fetal position, with the hands covering the face. The body was wearing nothing more than a sweater and had become partially mummified. Now, based on the construction that had been ongoing, it is possible that the position in which the body was found may not have been the position in which the body had originally been. The police were soon notified and they would show up at the scene with the county coroner. The body would be carefully removed, and using dental records, a positive identity was determined. This was the body of 18-year-old Joshua Maddux. He had finally been found after all this time, and he was less than a mile away from his family home. So what happened to Joshua? How did he end up in the chimney of this cabin? Well, according to the autopsy, the police determined that Josh's death was an accident. County Coroner Al Bourne would later state it was not a homicide. There was no indication of trauma. The hard tissue showed no signs of trauma. There were no broken bones, no knife marks, there were no bullet holes. There is so far no answer to a number of things. It is very confusing. It was not an instant death. How he died is only a matter of speculation, but we know he did not starve to death because that takes many weeks. So then you go down the chain and you have dehydration, which can take just a few days, and the other thing would be hypothermia, which could take a day or two. We have no evidence to say which one came first. Following the results from the coroner, Joshua's sister Kate would end up speaking with the Huffington Post. She stated, "One of the most traumatic things about this story is that the cabin he was found in is literally 2 blocks away from my dad's house. We looked through every part of the woods we thought he could walk to, but that cabin never came up." In the end, no one in Joshua's family knows why in the world he would have been anywhere near that cabin. The police ultimately ruled that Joshua climbed onto the roof of the cabin, down into the chimney, and had become stuck. After becoming stuck, he most likely called out for help, but there was no one close enough to the cabin that would have heard his screams. Joshua most likely would have succumbed to hypothermia or dehydration over the course of the next handful of days, maybe even a week. But not everyone agrees with the police's ruling of accidental death, as there are more pieces of evidence in this case that point to something more nefarious potentially taking place. That first piece of evidence is a heavy wire grate that was installed across the top of the chimney. According to owner Chuck Murphy, the chimney had been built 20 years prior. Upon its completion, it had been fitted with a large, thick wire mesh hung from steel hooks. This was used to keep animals and debris from becoming lodged inside the chimney or from entering into the cabin. When this information came to light, the county coroner would respond that this metal mesh had not been found or located at the crime scene, which has put into question whether or not it still had been in place at the time Joshua disappeared. But according to Chuck Murphy, the reason it wasn't located at the scene is because the construction crew had already removed all the metalwork from the site and had taken it all away for scrapping purposes. If this piece of information is true, it only adds to the mystery. Now let's take a look at another piece of evidence within this case: the large wooden breakfast bar that was blocking the chimney. This breakfast bar had been torn from a wall in the kitchen and dragged over to block the chimney from inside the cabin. This breakfast bar is most likely the reason that no one had noticed anything wrong within the chimney. Joshua's body was also found in a fetal position, with his legs above his head. In order to have gotten into such a position, Josh would have had to have entered the chimney head first, which seems bizarre in and of itself. The police had also thought about this and had tested for drugs within Joshua's system, thinking perhaps that could explain the irrational thinking and behavior, but no drugs were ever detected. Chuck Murphy also spoke to the local press about a disturbing detail that had not been shared by law enforcement prior. When Joshua's body had been found, he was only wearing a long-sleeved thermal shirt, but the rest of his clothes were not missing. His pants, underwear, and socks were all right outside the fireplace, on the other side of the breakfast bar. How did they get onto the other side of the breakfast bar? It's hard to imagine that Joshua entered the cabin, took off all of his clothes but his shirt, and then proceeded what? Outside? To then climb the roof and then climb down the chimney head first? Knowing that there was no way to exit once he got to the bottom, it simply doesn't make any logical sense. Chuck Murphy doesn't believe Joshua's passing was accidental at all. He believes there was someone else there with Joshua. He thinks that Josh was either trapped within the chimney and left to die, or he was killed within the cabin and then his body was stuffed into the chimney. This case is baffling to say the least, as there just isn't enough evidence to determine definitively that this was an accident or a homicide. Now, there is one more rabbit hole that we can head down in this case. There was a Reddit user that wrote about how a friend of theirs named Josh had recently started hanging out with this guy named Andy. This person named Andy would later be revealed to be Andrew Newman, and according to the Reddit user, the two planned to travel to New Mexico, but then Josh went missing. Following Joshua going missing, Andy still traveled to New Mexico, where he ended up stabbing someone. This Andy character also was said to have bragged about stabbing and stuffing someone else within a barrel in Taos, and indeed, the cops found someone in Taos stuffed in a barrel. According to this Reddit user, the police were notified, but never took any of these claims seriously. The Reddit user also claims that Andy had been heard bragging to others that he had put Josh in a hole. This claim was supposedly made prior to Josh being found inside the chimney. Now, from research I've done online, I found that Andrew Richard Newman has been in trouble with the law numerous times. It appears his mental health has drastically deteriorated over the years as well. Now, if this Reddit user is to be believed, then there potentially could be something here. But the problem is it's all circumstantial evidence. There's no proof that Joshua Maddux and Andrew Newman were indeed hanging out or friends. Also, with the cabin now completely gone, no evidence was ever found to connect Andrew Newman to the scene. As much as this potentially could be the answer, it very well could be a bunch of BS as well. We just don't know. But it is an interesting rabbit hole to go down. I myself struggle with the idea that Josh put himself in the chimney the way he did. Found a quote on Reddit that I thought was another good point that was made within this case. It reads, "This is just my opinion, but I don't care who you are. You don't try to climb headfirst into a chimney via a hole rusted through a metal grate with your dick hanging out." At the end of the day, Joshua Maddux's family were able to get a little bit of closure as to what happened. At the same time, there are still so many unanswered questions. Did Josh suffer alone in that chimney? Was he forced in there by someone at gunpoint? Was he murdered and then shoved in? Or did he simply make an illogical mistake in climbing into that chimney head first? It's at this point that I ask you all for your thoughts involving this case. What do you think happened to Joshua Maddux? Please let me know in the comment section below. Also, if you want to help support what I do here on the channel, please hit that like button and leave a comment. It helps with the algorithm and makes it so more people are recommended my videos. On that note, I want to send my deepest condolences to the Maddux family, as well as everyone that knew and loved Joshua and his brother. Thank you for tuning in to another episode. If you enjoy the content, please hit that like and subscribe button. It helps the channel continue to grow. Also, if you want to make sure you don't ever miss a new upload, you can turn on the bell notification after you subscribe. In the description box below, you will find a link to my merch store and a link to the Cellar Dwellers membership tier for the channel. If you're interested, please take a moment to check those things out. If you'd like to submit your own scary story or a story recommendation, you can do so using the email that is linked in the description box below. As always, I do all the research, writing, recording, and editing for the channel myself, so anything that you do to help support the channel is greatly appreciated. And until next time, I will see you all again as we head back into the cellar.